Sure. Okay. And so this week, I was going to go on with the Dhammapada, but I wanted to actually talk again. I'm steering off a tangent a bit here, but um, as we talk about the Dhammapada, in the Dhammapada, they talk about the right views and the right thoughts and right effort and diligence, etc. And in contrast to that, we talk about defilements, or in Sanskrit it's called klesa. And these defilements or hindrances that
Mute us.
prevent us from attaining enlightenment, if you will. Well, maybe I'll mute you all for now. When you want to speak, unmute yourself, okay? So, as I was thinking about that, I started thinking about the year end. And it's traditional in Japan and in temples throughout the world, especially with us, with well, not just Jodo Shinshu, but Japanese temples throughout the world. One of the traditions that we have at the year end is to ring the temple bell 108 times. Okay. And this tradition stems back from the Buddha's practice that when it is said that each of us has what we call 108 defilements or hindrances. And so at the year end, one is to go to the temple and listen as these bells are being rung 108 times. And you're supposed to reflect with each bell ringing, one of the 108 defilements that are within you slowly disappears along with the sound of the temple bell. And you start off with the new year fresh. And myself, I have very fond memories of the temple bells, and I wanted to share with you a few of the memories that I had. One of my strongest memories was when I first went to Japan to study, to become a minister. That first winter, my mother's family is a temple family in Kyoto. And their temple is actually, it's funny, when you're growing up as a kid, you don't really realize it. So our family, we lived in Japan for about 3.5 years when I was a child. Between when I was the ages of 3 to about 6.5, 7, we lived in Japan. And during that time, we lived in Kyoto, where my mother's family was. And we would go to visit her parents' temple. And I never realized all that time I was there how rare a place this actually was. In fact, we see, they have these historical dramas regularly on the Japanese TV. And a lot of the Japanese history occurred in the capital, it was then the capital city of Kyoto. And in fact, where my grandparents' temple is located, it's a very historic site. And just about a 20-minute walk away from a very, very famous, one of the most famous Shinto shrines called Yasaka Jinja. And Yasaka Jinja is located there are temples all around it as well. And so what people do on New Year's Eve, there's a main road that leads up to this Shinto shrine called Shijo Dori. So if you're talking about Vancouver, I'm just trying to think what the equivalent might be. Granville and Robson? No, it would have to be the most populated street, and I'm trying to have a difficult time thinking of a street like that in Vancouver. In Toronto, they have this street called Yonge Street, which goes up the center of Toronto, and it's sort of similar to that. This Shijo Dori or Shijo Street is the busiest street in Kyoto. But what happens on New Year's Eve, they block off a large section of it and it becomes pedestrian only. And before New Year's midnight, people start moving towards this Shinto shrine and the temples around there. And so when I first went to study in Japan, first winter, I asked my cousin, who has their temple about 20-minute walk from this shrine. I said, can we go to see this? Because I'd never seen that. And he looked at me like I was from outer space, because in all the years that he was raised in Kyoto, he never dared go because he knows how crazy it is. But because I was there for the first time, he says, sure. So he and his wife took me. And literally, as we get to this main road, this Shijo Dori, we're swept away by a wave of people. You can't move in any other direction other than the way the people are going. So it's literally a sea of people. Obviously not what you would see since the pandemic, but this is 87 was when, or I guess 88, the winter of 88. So we follow the sea of people, and we get up to we listen to the temple shrines, the temple bells at Chioin, which is a Jōdōshū temple. And after that, people go to the Shinto shrine. So what they do, what the whole idea is, on New Year's Eve, you go to the temple and listen to the temple bells, and at the same time, rid yourself of all the defilements that you've created over the previous year, and then you start off the new year fresh. And you go to the Shinto shrine and you pay your homage to the shrine and wish for a good year. And then the tradition in Kyoto, at least around that area, is that you would purchase this little string, or it's a rope, actually, piece of rope. And at the end of the rope, they light it on fire. So you have this little ember that's burning, and you're supposed to take that ember home with you. So you're swinging it around, and you're supposed to light your, well, back then, I guess it would have been your kitchen stove. This is going back ages. To light the first fire in the house using that ember, okay? But so anyways, that was my first big memory of New Year's Eve. Then my second memory was when I was about to get married to my wife. So I got to spend a winter at her parents' temple. Now her parents' temple is a complete opposite of Kyoto. My wife comes from Kyushu, which is a southern island of Japan. And you think southern island, you think tropical, nice, warm place. But in fact, where her temple is in the center of the island of Kyushu, which is still a very big island, and her temple is located on top of a mountain. So at wintertime, it gets very cold. In fact, at times they'll get accumulation of snow. Not that great, but the temperature will go down to 0. Okay. So I got to spend a New Year's Eve at her parents' place, and her parents' place is their temple is situated in a very picturesque area. It's on a plateau on top of these mountains. And so around the temple are all these rice paddies with houses dotted here and there. And some of the houses even still had the thatched roof, the old traditional style roofing. So in this very country setting, I spent New Year's Eve. And there they had, when they rang the temple bell, just, a few families from surrounding neighborhood would come out. And I remember they would put, so they ring the bell 108 times. And in order to count that, they had one box full of soybeans. And every time you would strike a bell, you would move over the soybeans to count it, right? So that you count the 108. So that's my second memory of this. And then when I went to Toronto, and Toronto is also a very unique situation because on New Year's Eve, in 1977, the Japanese Canadian community donated to the province of Toronto. They were commemorating the anniversary. What was that? The 100th anniversary since the first Nikkei landed in Canada. In 1977, the Japanese Canadian community donated a temple bell. They called it a peace bell to the Ontario government. And the Ontario government placed this peace bell there's a small island right on Lake Ontario. And they called it Ontario Place, and it was a provincially owned, they had an amusement park on this little island. And on in one corner, they had this sort of garden type area. And they made a place for this peace bell. And they would put up they put up this peace bell there. So every year on New Year's Eve, we had special permission to go into this Ontario Place to ring the temple bell. And it was very interesting because, as I mentioned, Ontario Place was an amusement park, which is open during the summertime, but in December, everything is completely closed. But because we had special permission, and one of the things that we would do is we would give out as a gift to everyone who would come out, we would make mochi, rice cakes at the temple. And so usually on about the 27th or 28th of December at the temple, we made about 800 pounds of rice every year. And they would sell some of it. So the temple would become a mochi making factory. About 100 people would come out, and we would spend the whole day making these rice cakes. And they would sell it to the members, but they also made enough to take out to Ontario Place. So given special permission, we used to drive just by myself, because I would carry all the rice cakes with me. So I would take a vehicle in, and I would go through this empty, dark amusement park. It was kind of eerie, almost like a horror show, Nobody's there. It's the middle of winter, and you go through this, all through this amusement park, all the way around to get to this back corner where they had the temple bell. And then just about 15 minutes before midnight, then the security guards would lead, so the other people who were coming to the bell ringing, they would have to wait outside of Ontario Place. And then about 15 minutes prior to midnight, the security guards would lead them. They would walk in, and through Ontario Place. And it was very odd because here we are, it's sort of a secluded corner of this Ontario Place, this little island. And so I would be there, well, usually it was my family, and maybe we had 2 ministers in Toronto at that time. And so we would be waiting there, and then about 10 to midnight, you would see these silhouettes coming over this little hill, and all these people start walking in, out of nowhere they appear. And we would have maybe up to 200 people coming out for this bell ringing. And some years it was okay, but some years you can imagine being right on Lake Ontario, it can get very cold. So we were out there sometimes at minus 20 degrees weather, ringing the temple bell. So that was in Ontario. And then here in Steveston, since we came, we would ring the temple bell here at our temple. And we allow everybody who comes to ring it once. And we were actually, up until 2 years ago, we were providing, so one of the traditions on New Year's Eve is to eat noodles. Okay, in Japanese they call it toshikoshi soba, but soba is buckwheat noodles. But here we give it toshikoshi udon. Udon is the thicker noodles, right? The noodles are eaten for longevity because they're long. So for wishing a long life, you eat these noodles. So here in Steveston, we would ring the bells, and then we would serve people who come here the noodles. I'm kind of glad we don't do that, because I don't get home till like 2:30 in the morning because we're busy serving noodles to people and cleaning up afterwards. But anyways, that's beside the point. But all these different places, we ring the bell, and traditionally they're rung 108 times. And so I thought it'd be interesting, or to think a little bit about this 108. And we say the 108 comes from, we have 108 defilements. But to give you a little bit more exacting interpretation or understanding of this, there are actually numerous explanations from how they get 108 defilements, like why we have 108 defilements. The most commonly used explanation in Japan, it says that, first of all, that we have the sensory perceptions. So we have this perception of sight, which is associated with our faculty, our eyes, right? And then hearing, our ears, smelling, our nose, tasting, our tongue, and of course touching, which is the tactile sense. And added to this is consciousness. And with the consciousness, we need the consciousness in order to be able to perceive things. So that's 6 right there, okay? So we call these 6 sensory perceptions. And then each one of your perceptions, you can sense it in 3 different ways. One is pleasant, or you might sense it as unpleasant, or you might be neutral, okay? So that if you multiply the 6 by 3, you get 18, okay? So each sensory perception, you can sense it in 3 different ways, right? So let's say hearing, you could hear a large scream that could hurt your ear, right? So that would be unpleasant. Or you might hear my beautiful chanting voice. That could be pleasant. I'm kidding. Okay. Or it could be just a neutral sound, right? So those are 3 ways you can hear something. And that's the same with the other perceptions as well. So 3 times 6, you get 18. Now, each of these experiences can also be classified as pure or tainted. Okay, pure or tainted. And what this means, pure A pure experience is one that has not been tainted by our past experiences. Okay. Now, a good example of this, and you'll get it right away when I say this to you, is when you hear about people who have had bad experiences with eating raw oysters, right? The next time they eat raw oysters, they're already going to have a perception in them of getting sick, and therefore they're less likely to enjoy the oyster the next time they have it. Okay, so that's tainted already, their perception. It's not pure, it's tainted by their past experience. But, and when you think about it, that first eating of the oyster actually has no connection with the second eating of the oyster, except for my tainted perception, okay? Because it's completely separate incidents. So technically speaking, they shouldn't be connected to one another, right? Unless you're eating the same batch of oysters. But if you're eating, on a separate, let's say a year or two later, there shouldn't be any connection between the two, but our tainted perception makes it so that we have an aversion to it, okay? So that's a tainted experience versus a pure experience, right? Where you don't have that tainted perception to begin with. So when we take those, so I took 6 perceptions, multiplied by 3 ways of perceiving it to get 18, and you multiply that by 2, the tainted or pure experience, and you get 36, right? 18 times 2 is 36, right? And it's said then that each of these experiences occur in the past, the present, and the future. So you multiply it by 3 times 36, and you get 108. Okay? So I'm going to be sending my notes out later today, so you don't have to memorize all of this. You'll have it with you. But now you'll know where the 108, or one explanation of how they get 108 defilements. Okay. Another interesting explanation, which is used by Tibetan Buddhists often, and it comes from the what we call the Abhidharma. Abhidharma were commentaries on the teachings of the Buddha, and it said that it talks about 98 what we call primary defilements or afflictions that exist in the realms of desire, form, and formlessness. And I'm not going to go into each of these because it gets a little bit heady. But it also talks about, on top of those 98, there are 10 afflictions created through our erroneous views, or through our egos. Okay, brought about by our egos. And these 10, they talk about the absence of shame. So even if you do things that you know are wrong, you don't care about it. The absence of embarrassment before others. So this is sort of similar, but not feeling remorseful versus this one is not getting embarrassed by doing these acts. Okay? I had in Toronto, when I was a minister there was a young couple, and they would, I guess they were very much in love, but they would sit in our Dharma services, and they would start making out, and they would be right in front of me. And I know those seniors that were sitting around them were very, very uncomfortable with them. And not that that's a wrong thing to do or anything, but they had no embarrassment of doing this in front of people in the middle of service, and very interesting. But anyways, absence of embarrassment, envy, stinginess, regret, sleepiness, restlessness, sloth, anger, and the concealment of wrongdoing. These were 10 defilements based on our ego, basically. So because of our ego, we get attached to it. And in fact, when they talk about the defilements when they talk about our defilements, sometimes people get mistaken, and we often have a negative view on them. But defilements are sometimes it's actually it's not negative in itself. It's that we get attached to these defilements that creates the negativity. I'll get back to that in a second. But so from this Tibetan perspective, there are this 98 primary defilements, and then you add these 10 that are brought on by our false ego, and that creates 108. Okay, so that was a different explanation. It's a little bit more complicated to understand. And then yet another explanation. This is strictly Japanese, and it's kind of an odd explanation for it, but it comes out to 108. So when we talk about the first noble truth in the Four Noble Truths is the truth of suffering, right? And traditionally we talk about four major sufferings: birth, sickness, old age, and death. And then we talk about four other, what we call auxiliary sufferings: having to part with loved ones, having to coexist with those we dislike, not fulfilling our desires, and also our attachment to the five aggregates that we're made up of, or basically our attachment to our physical body and the environment around us. Okay, so we talk about four main sufferings and then four auxiliary sufferings. So in Japanese, though, they call this shikuhaku, which means shi is four, ku is suffering, and haku is a abbreviation for hachiku. Hachi, it means 8. So when you add the four main sufferings and the four auxiliary suffering, you get 8. Okay, so when they talk about it in Japanese, they often refer to it as 4 sufferings and 8 sufferings. Okay, 8 including those 4 main sufferings as well. But there's a terminology for it. They call it shikuhaku. And so also in Japanese, taking that as a basis, local regular Japanese, when somebody is flustered or feeling really overwhelmed, or how could I say it? Feeling like they've got so many things going on at the same time, there's a Japanese word that they use. They say shikuhaku suru, right? And that comes from this 4 8 sufferings. Okay. But anyways, so the third explanation for the 108, and this one kind of threw me for a loop, is basically a pun on words. Okay, so shi means 4. Okay, ku is suffering, but ku can also mean 9. Okay, so the number 9, it's a completely different spelling, but it has the same pronunciation. Okay, so 4 times 9 is 36, and then haku, 8 times 9 is 72. So 36 and 72, you add them together and you get 108. Okay, so that's another explanation I found. That one was kind of bizarre. I don't think there's any actual basis to it other than it's a pun on words, right? But regardless of all this, so what they talk about though is that all of these sufferings are basically based through our what we call the 3 major defilements or 3 poisons. And that this has been a a theme that has come up repeatedly in this class as well as the other classes, is the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance, right? The basis for all these sufferings, all these defilements come out from greed, anger, and defilements. And so if we go to that first explanation when we talk about our sensory perceptions, right? It only becomes bad when our greed, for instance, we see a very good-looking, delicious-looking cake that we want, right? And it only becomes bad when our greed takes over, and you know you're only supposed to have one small slice, but it's so good that I want more, and you keep on eating more and more of the cake, and that's when it causes you suffering, right? So in many senses, they're saying that some of these what we call defilements are actually necessary in life. Okay, so it's okay to have aspiration. Without aspiration, we wouldn't have inventions. We wouldn't have all the we wouldn't be able to do this Zoom lecture. Somebody had aspirations. They wanted to do something, create, and that's not a bad thing. Okay, it's only when the greed, anger, and ignorance take over that it can lead to a bad thing. Okay, so some things in life you need. There are needs that you have to have. The basic need to survive. People have to have a hunger to eat. We need to do these things. But again, there's a difference between satiating our hunger and gluttony, if you will. Okay. So and basically, what was I going to say? Oh yeah. So if we could remember the fact that what was that? So if you're ringing the New Year's bell on New Year's Eve, or if you happen to have the opportunity to ring a bell on New Year's Eve, one of my teachers once told me, and I found this a very good way of ringing the New Year's bell, and I've written it in our year-end articles in the past, is that when we ring the bell, if we think to ourselves, how many times over the course of the past year has my personal greed caused suffering to others? Okay, and as we strike the New Year's Eve bell, if you contemplate to yourself, how many times over the course of the past year have I lost my temper and gotten angry, causing suffering to others? And also, as we strike the bell, we contemplate how many times has my ignorance led me to false conclusions, causing suffering to others? And finally, when we contemplate, all the suffering I cause to others is the root of my own suffering. Okay, so if we think about the suffering, if we think of the core of greed, anger, and our ignorance, and if we contemplate on that, then we can also reflect on the fact that that adage of what goes around comes around, it actually creates our own suffering. And that's one thing that is very strongly said in Buddhism, is that the external forces is not what's causing the suffering. It's my own internal self that causes my own suffering. External causes can cause pain, and it could cause grief, but the suffering part is brought on upon by myself. Okay, and so when we think of these defilements, and so when we look at the Dhammapada, the readings that we were doing, The controlling of all of this, controlling the mind or being diligent, is all about the self, right? Looking into the self. Of course, that being said, it is a very difficult thing to do. And I know all of us make New Year's resolutions, and often they last, well, some of us are better than others, but they may not last that long. And so the founder of our particular denomination, Shinran Shonin, who felt very strongly his defilements, he has been quoted in his the Tanisho, the record in Lament of Divergence. He says, because I am being bound to so much karmic evil, I feel even more deeply grateful to the primal vow, Amida Buddha's primal vow, which is just determined to save me. So, as we listen to the teachings, at the same time, he was very aware of his own human self. And by being human, he was also able to accept the fact that with his defilements, he is accepted by this teaching of compassion. So what I also wanted to mention, though, so with this 108, what's interesting is you see these, this is more of a traditional beads, okay? They're quite ingenious, actually, okay? So these beads, there are actually 108 regular beads on them, okay? And so they were traditionally called juzu. Juzu means counting beads, okay? And they were used in meditation and practice. So every time, let's say there was a practice of reciting the name of the Buddha or the Nembutsu. So you would they would count off one of these beads every time they recite it or do whatever practice they're doing. Okay? Now, after the 7th bead, you'll find a different colored one. And also after the 21st bead, you'll find a different colored one. And that's because some of the practices, they would only do 7 times. Some of them they would do 21 times. And so then between, halfway through, you have, these are called parent beads, okay? And so one of the fascinating things about these beads, as I mentioned, it reminds ourselves of the 108 defilements, but these were used very much like abacuses, okay? So you have all these beads here, and then you have the tassel. But before you get to the tassel, you also have beads down here. And these are counters as well. But what this does, so after you do, say, 108 times, you can count once here. So 108 once, okay? And then 108 twice. So there's 10 on this strand here. So you can go up to 1,080 times just by counting out these beads. So 108 once, 108 twice, right? So you multiply 108 by 10, and you get 1,080. Then you have 10 more down here, okay? So you can actually go 1,080 once, 1,080 twice, right? So you can do that. So these were like multipliers for this strand here, okay? So they were very much used for counting practice. And in fact, there are some, even in the Pure Land schools, there's some schools that believe the more we recite the name of the Buddha, the more benefit that you get. And so there was a belief that, there's a practice of reciting the name 1,000,000 times. And there's actually one temple, well, there might be more than one, but I know of one temple in Japan where they have these beads. Each bead is about quite a large size. And they sit in a large circle of people, and they pass this very large juzu, counting bead, and they would recite the name of the Buddha, and it was considered their practice. Okay, one of their practices. In our particular tradition, Jodo Shinshi tradition, most people carry this around. This is called onenju. Okay, this is called nenju or onenju. This is called juzu or ojuzu. Juzu means counting beads. O is an honorific. Okay, so a lot of words they'll put O in front of to make it more honorable, if you will. So this is ojuzu or juzu, counting beads. Onenju or nenju. Nenju means thought beads or mindful beads. Okay, and so for us in Jodo Shinshi, we normally have these beads, these simpler beads, and they're usually a derivative of the 108. So a lot of them will have 27 beads. Okay, so one quarter the total. And this is mindful to us, we say, of the interconnectedness or oneness of the universe. So we say each of these beads represents a sentient being. And if we take any one of them out, we break the harmony that exists. Okay? And we have our smaller beads, which we say represents our ancestors, our forefathers. We honor them, but they're not more nor less important than the rest. And the large one is the Buddha, and it's held together by the Dharma. And so in our tradition, when we put our hands together, we usually put our hands together through the beads. And it's said, in Buddhism in general, it's said the left hand represents the world of samsara, the world of suffering that we're in. And the right hand represents the world of enlightenment, the world of Buddha. And so when we put our hands together, it's a gesture of oneness, showing that the world of the Buddha, enlightenment, is actually one with this world of suffering. Now, I have a little issue with this because I'm left-handed, and I think it must have been a right-handed person that came up with this belief that the left hand is suffering and the right hand is enlightenment. Okay, from a lefty's perspective, that's discrimination. But anyways, that's a joke as well. Not to be taken seriously. But what's also interesting about these beads, I received these beads from my maternal grandfather when I completed my Tokudo, my introductory ordination in 1987. So it will be now 35 years since that time. And what's interesting about these particular beads, these are called Seiketsu Bodaiju. They're a type of Bodhi seeds, Bodhi tree seeds, and they actually start off this color. So they start off as this sort of light tan color, but the longer you use them, the oils from your hands rub off, and they end up getting darker and darker, and so it comes out with quite a different sheen over the many years. So that's but the point was these beads, the counting beads, are used in the practice, and they represent those 108 defilements. So I know this wasn't exactly the Dhammapada, but I thought for the year end this was an appropriate subject to talk about, so I wanted to share that with you. And now you know when somebody tells you we have 108 defilements, you can explain it to them. 6 sensory perceptions, you can perceive it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and it could be either tainted or pure, and then it happens in the past, present, and future. So if you can remember all that, you got it down pat. Okay? So thank you all. That's basically all I wanted to talk about this evening. And thank you all for having joined me during these sessions. And I do look forward to when we get together again, hopefully in February. Okay. And if you want to unmute yourself, you may do so.
Thank you,
Very
Sensei.
much.
Sensei.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.
It's very
Thank you.
entertaining.
Yeah, so if you're around this way, please feel free to drop by New Year's Eve. We'll be ringing the bell here. We have a service from 11:30, and then we ring the bell.
Oh.
Good night, everybody.
Okay.
Good night. Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Bye.
Happy
Thanks,
New
everyone.
Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Yes, please have
New
a
Year.
Bye.
peaceful year. And
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye, Grant. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.